first of a series of videos that I'm planning on doing about a book called The Lover Upon Trial. I'm no expert in any way, but I have read a lot of books of this era. And by that, I don't just mean I've read 3 or 4, and I don't mean I've just read them in a classroom with cliff notes, etc. I've battled my way through some really tough books and uncovered some really nice stories. And I have learned a few tricks that make it easier to read these books. I read a lot of these books when I was a teenager, and one thing I did then that I actually would still advise if they're a really tough read is start from chapter 3. That I used to do that all the time with all of them, because for some reason so many of these books, the first couple of chapters, they didn't really know how to launch into the story easily, and I think they wrote the story and then they came back and tried to put some fancy introduction with all the detail in it. They just overworked it to death, and very often the first couple of chapters are nearly unreadable, and that's a huge shame, because if you can get beyond them, you actually find some good story. Chapter 3 isn't far enough in for some books. For instance, Tom Brown's School Days, I think I usually start around like chapter 6 or so with that one. But for most, chapter 3 is a good starting point. So I'd just read the first paragraph or 2 of that, and if it hadn't really got into story, I'd skip another chapter and see. And then I'd get to the point where, yep, the story's flowing quite well, there's a bit of action, and if it didn't make sense, I'd just start skipping back. That's a rather complicated process. It did work for me, but not everybody wants to do that. So one thing I'm going to do here, because this book, The Lover Upon Trial, is one of those books. The first chapter is hard slog, but the story does settle down when you go in a bit. Now, having said that, this book doesn't actually have chapters. What it's got is every so often it's got some kind of little decorative bar where it sort of separates the text, and it's not even at the end of a page. Let's see if I can find one and see if the camera will show it. It has this sort of thing. It's just a single little line that breaks up the text between 2 paragraphs, and that's kind of all the clue you get that maybe that's a good chapter ending. And that part is, so in my read through, I am calling chapter 1. For this volume, it's up to page 33. But if anybody happens to have a volume of this and wants to read along with me, as it were, the point at which I'm calling the end of chapter 1 is the point at which Lady Middlemore falls asleep. So that's your clue. Up until that point, I would say, is one chapter. That fits very nicely as one chapter with the action. And it's a nice stopping point, because there you're looking forward to seeing what will happen next. If I was writing this book, I would call that the end of chapter 1. I guess that's what I'm saying. Now, because this is a different time period, I said in my last video that this book was published in 1848 and that this is an 1853 printing. I've looked further into that, and that's not true. I did find 1848 as a published date for this book online, but I think it's suspect. It looks to me, she wrote a book called Olivia that was published in 1848, and then came Sir Philip Hetherington in, I think it was 1852. I'd say this book, The Lover Upon Trial, was published in 1853. Somebody else has that date, and I agree with it. 1853 is when it was published. So this is actually the first printing of that book. And the other book of hers in this volume, there's actually 3 books in here, but only 2 of them are hers. So The Lover Upon Trial and her other book, which is A Voice, I'd say were both published for the first time in this volume in 1853. Now, as I started to say, the world was very different in 1853 to today, and I think as I go through the first chapter, there's going to be a lot of explanation needed. I won't need to do that all the way through the story. If I do it in the first chapter, that should give us the background to just get on with it. But there are a few things that we need to know, and one big cultural change in the publishing world, and maybe this isn't actually a big change at all, I'm not really sure, but one change here is that the status of the author made a big difference when it came to access to publishers. If you were aristocratic, if you were the wife of a titled gentleman, there was much more chance that your books would get published. There was also much more chance that you would be at leisure to write and have the education. But if you were, say, working class and somehow happened to have, like, for instance, think of governesses. There were governesses everywhere. It was very hard for them to get their books into print. They probably had evenings when they could write, and they certainly had the education, but to access a publisher took some networking. So the author of this book is Augusta Lyons, and she is the wife, or was the wife at this point. She was the wife of Sir Edmund Lyons, who was a naval officer who had achieved some very brave exploits and had a very good name and was moving up in the ranks in political society. And any publisher that she approached about publishing her works probably would have had to have a very good reason to say no, because you don't turn down a patron of the arts, especially when they can pay for the printing themselves, which they probably did, which she probably did. So the fact that she is in print is not really an indication of talent. Anybody who had the money could get a publisher and a printer to do some runs of their books and have them bound and have them placed in their families' houses. And some of these books are really bad stories. Some of them are very badly written. She did a pretty good job with this one. So, Augusta Lyons, she was born Augusta Rogers. She was the daughter of a naval officer who actually had his own memoirs published, and they're full of amazing adventures at sea and full of his own incredible exploits in the British Navy. That was the world she moved in. She was quite well travelled. Her family travelled with her father for a while, it seems. After her father died, which happened when she was still a child, she, I think, lived in England. In 1814, she married Sir Edmund Lyons. So she was the daughter of a naval officer, and presumably that's how she met her husband, because he was a naval officer too. So Edmund Lyons was titled, and upon marrying him, she became Lady Lyons. The books she wrote are set in the aristocratic world, and it was a world that she knew quite well. This is first-hand experience of the world that she's writing about. That's not just fantasy the way we would probably do it today. And her readers were most likely from the same social class. And that's one thing that I find very interesting about books like this, is the tiny little details that were just everyday to them that they throw in that are completely alien practices to us today. I find that rather fascinating. I haven't actually found Augusta's birth record. I did go looking. There are sites out there that say that she was born in 1793. Me from the future, I've just found Augusta's baptism. She was born on the 20th of June 1791, baptised a month later. She and her sister were baptised together, so I think they'd just returned from somewhere. Augusta married Edmund Lyons in July of 1814, so she just turned 23 at the time of marriage, and he was a few months older than she was. After marriage, she had 4 children with her husband, and he then went off into the Navy while she stayed back in England with the children, and because they were separated, no more children were born to them. And I don't know why no more children were born later, but the 4 children were the only children she had. By the time she wrote these books, she was much older. When her first book, Olivia, was published, she was 58 years old. There's no real indication when she wrote it. She might have written it 20 or 30 years before publication. She had these stories published because a friend of hers, a lady named Anne Marsh Caldwell, who was actually quite a well-known author in Victorian England at that time, thought that her stories had merit and were worthy of publishing. The only writing I've actually found where Augusta is talking about herself and her own work is the preface to her first book, Olivia. I'm sure she wrote a lot of letters, but they've either not survived or not been made public. And I'm not going to read this whole preface, but there's a few points in there that I think it's worth noting. She says, I believe a preface to a book is somewhat obsolete, yet as it seems to offer something of a support to one who is appearing for the first time before the public, I shall make use of one accordingly. I first began to write for the amusement of my own immediate family, and in one respect I was as fortunate as Scheherazade of the Arabian Nights, for no sooner was one story written and read than another was called for by my hearers. In the course of time, 2 or 3 of my productions of various sorts were confided to the perusal of one of the most admired authors of the day, and the result was decided approbation and the advice to publish. I was gratified by the one opinion, being her family wanting more stories, and allowed myself to be determined by the other, being her friend the author saying, you should get your stuff published too. After that, she says, since then, one of the first masculine geniuses of our country, whose fame is European, has read and approved a story of mine, which at one time I had intended adding to this, and that praise has been a great additional encouragement to one who has but little confidence in her own powers. Anyway, I'll leave that part there, but I do not know who that author is that she's talking about, a male author. In this world, a male author had more clout than a female author, so if a male author thought she should publish, then it was an even stronger case to do so. So she published, and as was the habit of the times, she didn't put a name to it. The first book, Olivia, came out as being written by a lady, and that does mean a titled lady. She was Lady Lyons, but she didn't actually say who she was, just a lady. I haven't actually found any copy of the next book, Sir Philip Hetherington. I will keep looking. But the 2 books in this volume, being The Lover Upon Trial and A Voice, I'm pretty sure were published for the first time in this volume in 1853. The same publishing company printed the whole lot, and that's Sims and McIntyre in London. And something I didn't know until I Googled her just recently is that Augusta died in 1852. So this volume was published posthumously, probably by her family, because it did take a lot longer then to get her work ready to print. So maybe it was with the publishers, and then when she passed away, they decided to continue on and do it. And it might be that that's what happened with these first couple of chapters. They're written in such a strange, convoluted way. It might be that she didn't have time to come back to them and fix them up. Or it might be that one of her family members just quickly went through and tried to finish it off for her after she'd passed away, just for the publication. The first chapter is a difficult read. So I think that's really what we need to know to get started. She was a mother and a grandmother herself. She is writing about a world that she knows quite well. And she is anticipating that the readers of this book will be people from her own world, from her own class. Okay, so on to the book itself. Just to make this simple, I didn't make it up. I wrote a sort of synopsis. Well, this could almost be the blurb for the book if it had such a thing. This is what is brought out in chapter 1, but I'll tell you this up front because otherwise you've got to do the reading and the rereading that I did. The spoiled and irresponsible Lydia Middlemore has an aristocratic bloodline but no fortune. Not that she knows anything about poverty. She has grown up in the family mansion with servants, beautiful gardens, and a constant stream of equally well-born visitors. Any troubles with money are kept firmly between her parents. They are the rigidly upright Sir William and the wise but controlling Lady Middlemore. Enter Mr. Charles Mornington, Esquire, a bachelor neighbour of immense fortune. Charles is awkward and unsophisticated, his education barely adequate and his pedigree highly suspect, but he has fallen in love with Lydia and makes her an offer of marriage. It's the perfect solution to a multitude of problems. The Mornington money will not only give Lydia all the security she could need, there's enough to help Lydia's sisters as well. And Lydia's aristocratic breeding will raise the Morningtons significantly in Victorian English society. On top of that, Charles is every bit as besotted as a young lady could want of her husband. Lydia's instant refusal is the only spanner in the works. She doesn't like him at all. The disconcerted Sir William, that's her father, negotiates a compromise. Mr. Mornington may visit the Middlemore family as often as he likes, and Lydia will do her best to get to know him without prejudice. This is a story of two immature young adults coming to know themselves through their attempts to know each other. So, about this book, there's a few things I noticed. One is there are a lot of similarities with Pride and Prejudice in the opening plots. The family group here is genteel but not very rich. The father hides himself away in his library. Lydia is the second daughter in the family. She has a more demure older sister who is the acknowledged beauty of the family and is definitely more mature. And Lydia herself is very high-spirited and irreverent. In many ways, the opening scenario of this, which is that the wealthy neighbour has come over, made her an offer of marriage. She's not really interested in him, but it would really help the family if she accepted it. That is kind of like when Mr. Collins proposed to Lizzie, and she was under pressure to accept. And I don't see anything wrong with that, the fact that she's taken that scenario and run with it. It's a great way to get going. It's only a problem if you're going to copy that scenario right through with all the same beats. But what Augusta Lyons has done is taken that snapshot, that particular scenario, and taken it all in a different direction. The Middlemores are clear aristocracy. Sir William Middlemore is a baronet. They're not just a gentleman's family with less respectable ties. Their position in society is very secure. Their family home, the Grange, is clearly a bigger, better appointed place than the Bennet's house. It is a proper estate. And I have now found a copy of Sir Philip Hetherington through Google Books, and reading the opening pages of that, I can see she's done it again. That starts off with a single, highly eligible bachelor gentleman who finds himself in the country and has been forced to attend a country dance that he doesn't want to go to. So if you're at all acquainted with Pride and Prejudice, that will probably help in picturing this scenario. So I'll talk first about the characters. Our main character is Lydia Middlemore. I actually find that name really hard to say. I do wonder if she said it out loud at any point. She must have, but Lydia Middlemore is kind of a tongue twister to me. Lydia Middlemore is 19 years old. She's going to be 20 soon. She is the second daughter in the family. She has an older sister, Louisa. She has two younger sisters, Flora and Fanny. And she has two brothers. And Lydia comes across to me as, if not spoiled, she's been very much pampered. She seems to be full of fun. She's always laughing and playing, and she's quite happy to play with her little sisters. She does come across as a child, though. That's at the beginning of this. Although she's 19, there's nothing of the adult about her, and there doesn't need to be. In British society of this time, the age of adulthood was 21. She is a minor. You did get girls marrying at that age, for sure, but nobody's put that pressure on her. And as her father says in this chapter, it's his view that you shouldn't get married until you're closer to 25, which was a common view back then, that 25 was the age of adulthood, really. If you're 21, you're still way too young. And so at the age of 19, nobody's really pushed her to grow up in any way. Lydia has three sisters. The elder one is Louisa. Louisa is the Jane Bennet of the story in every respect. She is demure and responsible and kind-hearted and the acknowledged beauty of the family. And she and Lydia are very close. The two of them are close in age and they've grown up together and they pretty much do everything together. They're each other's best friends, like Jane and Lizzie in Pride and Prejudice. Louisa, I think, must be around 23 or 24 years old. I'm hoping to finish this video in the next hour or two, but the cold is really coming in now, so I'll see how it goes. Lydia's father, Sir William, We get the briefest cameo. He's a rigid man who loves punctuality and routine. He spends all his time in his library. In that world, the library, like the study, was the male domain. It was the centre of learning, and really it was the place of power. Although girls did read books, they didn't have the full range of literature available to them. There were a lot of editorials at the time talking about the dangers of young ladies reading at all because of the damage it did to their morals and to their minds. It gave them notions about life choices that they didn't really have, and that led to them rejecting the life choices that they did have. And the library was an alien room to the girls in the house. There were areas, even in your own home, where you could go and where you could not go. The library was Sir William's. And that's where we see him. In the library, it references his maps and his papers. It doesn't actually tell us what he does for a living. We know he's a baronet. And I think he's probably similar to Augusta's own husband, who was a naval officer and a diplomatic envoy, who would also have had maps and papers and such things spread over his desk. And his introduction is a rigid, somewhat slow-thinking but methodical man. And from his library, he exercises control over the entire of the house. His routines are the ones that everybody goes by. His rules are obeyed instantly without question, whether he is present or not. That said, in the very opening scene, Lydia is disregarding his summons. The next important character is Lydia's mother, Lady Middlemore. We don't know her first name at this point. It might come out. I feel there's an element of the self-insert about Lady Middlemore. Lady Middlemore is described in this as being quite wise and quite perceptive and fully in control of the whole household while pretending that she's just a submissive wife. And I can't say that she's a self-insert. She just comes across that way. She's in the same position. She's the wife of a baronet, just as Augusta Lyons was, and she just sits in the background strategically making all the right moves and presenting the appearance of the fully supportive wife. If she is a self-insert, I actually don't think that matters. That's a point of interest as well, because a self-insert for today, we don't need to see. But a self-insert in 1853 is kind of interesting in its own right. To see how somebody might imagine their life could be, it tells us a lot about the time. And if she's not a self-insert, she's still very interesting in the way she functions within the gender role that's been assigned to her. And gender roles were huge in this time period. Not only were they big in the general time period, but something I didn't mention before is that I know we've all heard about the lady authors who gave themselves a male pseudonym in order to be published. That was absolutely correct, that happened. But there were lady authors. The trouble with being a lady author was that your book was constrained to the home circle, which means you didn't get a wide readership. You weren't really taken seriously. It was basically fireside tales for your children and your tolerant and gently amused husband. And there was a lot of pressure on the ladies of the aristocracy to be the moral compass of the nation. And I know you can find a lot where they... whatever happened behind the scenes, that was the public image. And many of them did ascribe to that and live by it quite diligently. So Augusta in this book has presented Lady Middlemore, the lady of the house, as being very genteel and able to resolve her issues without conflict, to the advantage of her family. To the modern eye, it looks really awful. Some of it looks toxic, some of it looks... Sometimes you just feel sorry for her, the lengths that she has to go to do something that we would just come out and do today, the things that she couldn't say, the ways that she circumvented issues in the family home. But it does make for a very interesting study. And she's clearly presented as a role model and not problematic in any way. we're told about her. We don't really see her in action much. Although we're told that Sir William is methodical and routine driven, we also see that in this chapter. But Lady Middlemore, we don't. We're told that she's the one that actually has the real power in the house, and that she allows Sir William to believe that he does. That's not what you see. You actually see Sir William having the power. The first time we meet Lady Middlemore in this chapter, she is sitting behind her husband knitting in the library when Lydia comes in. And this is an unusual place for her to be at this time of the day, and that is an unusual pastime for her to be doing. But she is clearly presenting the image of the submissive, quiet wife in the background while keeping an eye on things. So that's kind of what we're told, and we do see a little of that. That's pretty much all the family we get to meet. The first chapter, in its convoluted, roundabout way, actually does a great deal in this story. It sets up the family dynamics, so we get to see that Lydia and Louisa are very close to each other and have a very affectionate relationship with each other. We see that Sir William cares about his family but cannot step outside his routines in any way for anybody. Lady Middlemore remains a mystery. She's just this woman in the background. And having introduced the family myself, I'm going to go into the opening sentence, which is not how an opening sentence should be done. And here it is. It's nice and short. If you please, Miss Lydia, Sir William wishes to speak to you in the library. That's it. It's dialogue, pure dialogue, and there is no tag, so we do not know who spoke. We know that somebody is speaking to Miss Lydia, and we know that Sir William wishes to speak to her. So to that extent, that's a good beginning because we've got an action there. This is Lydia's summons to the library. If you come from that world, you would probably deduce pretty easily that this is a servant talking to her by the manner of speaking. And because the first sentence tells us so little about the whole thing, I'll just read the beginning of the next. The next is a paragraph-length sentence. There's a few of them. What? Exclaimed a young girl seated on a low stool with a kitten on her lap which she had just managed to insert as well as she could into a doll's frock belonging to her little sister. Etc., etc., etc. There's a few things here. Now, this kitten scene almost put me off when I first read it. That doesn't continue. And there are books out there telling parents not to allow their children to do this because it's not fair on the animals. This kitten was not hurt in this scene. I will say that now. This kitten is in it later, happy and relaxed. But I thought it was a horrible introduction. We've got Lydia. Lydia is sitting on a low stool. She's got the kitten on her lap and she's busily dressing the kitten in her sister's doll's dress. And she's doing it because her sister finds it entertaining, so she's doing it to entertain her sister. But as it says here, really she is getting great enjoyment out of this as well. The kitten is struggling furiously because it doesn't want this. And there's like a page of description of the kitten rolling around trying to get itself out of this dress, which I find rather horrifying. And I can only reiterate, the kitten comes in a bit later on. The kitten is fine. It's just a horrible thing and nobody should ever do this. But this is 1850 and they didn't fully understand these things. And I guess it could be worse. And I think this scene might be an indication that Lady Middlemore doesn't actually have as much control over her daughters as she thinks she does, or as Augusta is telling us she does. Because even in this era, this wasn't a done thing. This was not girls being kind and nurturing as they were supposed to be. Which might come back to the bit I said before about her being a self-insert. If she is a self-insert, is this how Augusta saw the dynamics in her own house? Did she feel that she was putting up with privations in order to actually maintain control over the house? Because when you look at it from the modern time, looking at this book, and you look at who's doing what and who's saying what, it doesn't actually... I'm not convinced that Lady Middlemore has the control that she says she does. or that we are told that she does. And I know this is going to feel like we're taking forever to get into the story, but there is just a few more things to set up this scenario. Now, girls of this era, those who read the classics will know about the rigidity of the gender roles in this era, how separately the female and the male spheres were kept. This was a big house. It's called the Grange. It's definitely a manor house with as many rooms as you could need in a house. And the house is separated into spheres. So we've got Sir William's sphere, which would be his bedroom and his study and his office and the library. And we've got Lady Middlemore's rooms, which would be a sitting room and her bedroom and probably a parlour. I don't quite remember what she has at this point. And we've got the children's rooms. The boys and the girls were kept quite separate. So if the boys are here in the house, they won't be playing with the girls very much. I think the boys might be off to school. There's really no mention of them here. But even if they were in the house, they're not going to be with the girls. So the girls generally lived upstairs. They had the grounds to walk around in. It does talk about that later. They ate their meals in the dining room, but their main area was upstairs. But they had their bedrooms and they had their own, maybe a sitting room. In this case, there's a schoolroom because they're only just out of the school years. So I'm pretty sure, although it doesn't actually say here, I think this scene took place in the schoolroom because we've got Fanny here, the youngest girl, who is, I think, only about 10 or 12. She may be younger. Sometimes she comes across like she's 5, and then other times they say she's starting to grow up now too. It's so hard to know. And when Lydia comes across as if she's only about 10, it's hard to gauge how old Fanny actually is. But I'm pretty sure we're in the schoolroom. So we've got the schoolroom, we've got the 4 girls, and they'll have a governess. The older ones no longer have a governess, and once the governess stops looking after them, who is there to give them guidance if the mother isn't too involved with them? And the mother doesn't seem to be. So they're up here still in the schoolroom because they're kind of left school, but they're still at home. And they're doing things like tormenting innocent kittens. Not in a sense of meanness, but just because they actually just don't know any better. So that's the impression I get of this household, is that the girls are kind of running wild. This was certainly not uncommon. In a time when governesses were the only ones to control the children, and if the children didn't like what the governess said, they would just go and talk to their parents, and the parents would say, I don't want these kids bothering me, you've just got to keep them happy. And then the governess had absolutely no control over them whatsoever, and they grew up kind of like this. It just came down to the natural inclination of each of the children as to what sort of adults they turned out. That wasn't always how it was, and I've read a lot of literature about advice to parents and how you should do it and how you could do it. But I think what we're seeing here is a place where the girls just have too little to do, and they're certainly not responsible. While they're up here dressing this kitten, a summons comes to Lydia to go and see her father in the library. And this surprises everybody because their father never does this. This is not his routine. He doesn't like them being in the library. That's his private space. And we get to see a little bit of Lydia's personality here because instead of running off to do this, and she's too caught up in the fun to take it seriously and obey. So the first thing she does instead of obeying is just turn to her sister and say, what can he want? And then we get the classic looking in the mirror to describe the main character scene. And it's interesting to see that this trope was alive and well in 1853. Lydia viewed herself in a large glass over the mantelpiece, and she's suddenly aware that she's all messy because the kitten was fighting her and pulled her hair out, half out. She has ringlets. In those days, ringlets were very fashionable. That was kind of the ideal that you saw in... This was the time when ringlets were very fashionable. She's trying to twist the ringlets into proper order. And she's taking so long doing this that the library bell rings again very sharply, and the footman is once again sent to get her. And so we get the notion that she's all over the shop. Then we get this library scene where Lydia is standing there before her father. He's seated in his armchair, and Lady Middlemore is sitting just a little bit behind him, doing her knitting, quietly doing her knitting. And Lydia, who is quite quick-witted, and this is where we're told that she's quite quick-witted, she notices that her father doesn't have his usual papers and maps spread out, and her mother is knitting, and that's unusual. So things are up, something's up. And Sir William, who tends to be prosy, launches into a bit of a lecture, which he likes to do. And we see now that Lydia has been well trained to not interrupt, because despite all her other unruly behaviour, she stands there and listens, doesn't even dream of interrupting her father. And here again, I think you can see Sir William having control over the household. The tone of this scene is almost humorous, and I think that's part of Augusta's plan. Augusta is certainly not laughing at any of these characters, but she's attempting to highlight the foibles, which once again I think she was influenced by Jane Austen quite a bit. And Sir William tells her that Mr. Mornington, the neighbour, has made an offer of marriage, which is another nuance of the time. I mean, we all know that it was an old custom for men to go and get permission from the father and ask the father for the daughter's hand in marriage. But the way Mr. Mornington has done this is unusual, because he's got very limited acquaintance with Lydia. There was a couple of ways that marriage was brokered, if I can use that word, in this era. It certainly was common for the parents to have some communication, like somebody who's got a daughter might send a message to somebody else who's got a son and say, I'm quite interested in a match between our youngsters, what do you think? And then the parents would negotiate back and forth and work out dowries and such things, marriage settlements. And then after that, they would bring the youngsters together. That did happen. But the more common way was that the two in question, the two who were going to get married, would know each other. They'd be acquaintances, and they would actually come to that arrangement first. They would know that they liked each other before he went and saw the father and said, I'm interested in marrying your daughter. It wasn't quite the way you might go and buy your neighbour's grey mare, as it were. It wasn't really done that way. So the way Mr. Mornington has done it here, it's not really appropriate. And he had met Lydia, that comes out, but they certainly had no kind of understanding. And that is something that a reader of the time would have recognised instantly. But at the same time, he is a respectable neighbour, he is a single man, and he does have a large fortune, and Sir William jumps at this. As he says to Lydia here, this goes against a lot of things that he believes, but the advantages are just too great for him to ignore. It's hard to tell if he thinks that Lydia will refuse. I don't think he does. I think he thinks that she will be flattered at the very least and open to the idea. I do think he expected Lydia to be very surprised by this, and she is. She's very surprised, but he certainly doesn't expect her to reject it. He kind of expects her to see it, to see the advantages that he does and be blown away by what a brilliant match it really is for her. And what he says here is, setting aside your youth, I see great advantages, yes, very great advantages in such a match. And I think you have, upon the whole, too much common sense not to agree with me, my dear Lydia. So then we get into a nice bit of setup for the story where Lydia is running through all the traits that she wants in a husband that Mr. Mornington lacks. She wants him to be tall, but not too tall. Mr. Mornington is too tall. He's about 6'3". He's got to be tall, but not that tall. I can't remember the list. He must be handsome, but he can't have red hair. He must have a love of music. He must be fond of poetry. He must be kind and generous and charitable and clever and agreeable and well-read. Anyway, all the usual things. It's enough to show that Lydia hasn't really thought about marriage so much. She's just got this idea in her head that's a very superficial list of qualities, many of which are very subjective, and the ones that aren't subjective are sort of strange things like he can't have red hair. It does show that she has an unrealistic ideal in her head. And also that Mr. Mornington has a tough job ahead of him if he wants to convince her that he's the right one, because he's competing with an impossible perfect vision. But the final quality she mentions is that her future husband must have an intellect to match her own. She doesn't want to marry a dullard. And that is one thing that she says here about Mr. Mornington. She's probably rather prejudiced now because this is after she knows of his offer. And her father says, well, how do you know Mr. Mornington doesn't have all that? And she says, I have only to look in his face, that dull, heavy face. She thinks he's ignorant, she thinks he's blockish, she thinks he's too tall because he's 6'3", but she reckons he's 6'3". He is certainly a very tall man. And Herculean, which is a description you don't see now, but it just means he's got very broad shoulders. He's like a barrel-chested, broad-shouldered, very big man. In the modern world, he'd probably make a fantastic footballer, but for that era when they liked a tidy waist and somebody who could do fencing and, you know, the sort of person that was popular in those days, light on their feet, Mr. Mornington is the antipathy of all that. So William has a few things to say about that. And it's at this moment that a dressmaker turns up. And Lydia's way more interested in the dressmaker and hoping that her father will wind up his speech so that she can go and try on the dress, because the dressmaker is making all the girls' dresses. And that's far more in her thoughts. I'm not really sure what this scene does except to show us her mindset, that she's not really taking this very seriously. She said no, she's not interested, and really there's no more to be said. But so William tells her, I like this man, I think it could work, I want you to try very hard to find good in him. If you still don't, after you've seen a lot of him, then okay, I'll accept that you're saying no. That's what it comes down to. So for us as the reader, we've got our list of characteristics that Lydia is going to judge this man by, so we can sort of assess as the story goes through how successful he is being without the book having to tell us all the time, and that's sort of nice. And then the luncheon bell rings, and because Sir William is a methodical man, he actually breaks off his rambling speech mid-sentence, almost mid-word, and stands, and he and Lady Middlemore walk out to go to the dining table without another thought for Lydia, and she's left there on her own. Lydia, feeling like a bird out of a cage, unseen by either parent, gave one quick pirouette upon her heel and followed them into the dining room. And there's a bit here that it really struck me. It says, in the dining room there were already assembled the handsome Louisa and the two schoolroom young ladies, Flora and Fanny. So the poor dressmaker was obliged to wait. And I think that's horrible. This dressmaker, who is a businesswoman earning her own living, who has come out to measure the girls at a prearranged time, I gather, and she's probably measured all the rest, but she couldn't measure Lydia because Lydia is in this talk with her parents. And it's just acceptable that this dressmaker now has to sit here while they have lunch. And I don't think they're hurrying their lunch. She'll just sit there. Hopefully they feed her. But what about her business? What about all the work she has to do? The other thing about this segment in the story that I noticed is that Lydia could not talk to Louisa at the dining. She could not talk of this offer because it was the two younger girls' dinner. And such an important event as an offer of marriage could not be discussed before them. And I think that's interesting, that she doesn't feel this is an appropriate subject to discuss when the two girls are there. The other thing there is that it's their dinner. It's luncheon. This is luncheon, but dinner is like the big meal of the day. And for the two schoolroom girls, the younger girls, they go to bed early in the evening and they just have a light supper in their schoolroom. So this for them, it's luncheon for everybody else, but it's dinner for them because this is their big meal because they have the early night. It's probably exactly the same food, but that's what that means when it says that it is dinner for the two schoolroom girls. And the day goes on full of frustrations because Lydia wants to talk about the offer with her sister Louisa, but after lunch some visitors turn up and they're there all afternoon. And Sir William likewise wants to discuss the offer with his wife, but because the visitors are there, he can't either. Sir William does manage to slip away to his library and write a letter to Mr. Mornington to say, well, she didn't say yes, but she's agreed to spend time with you and see if she likes you, so come over any time you like and we'll just see what happens. And because of that letter, the very second the visitors leave, when Lydia thinks finally she can tell Louisa what's happened, Mr. Mornington himself shows up. And that's good for us, the reader, because we get to meet Mr. Mornington early on and we can see for ourselves what the chances of this marriage are and whose side we're going to be on. Are we going to be on Lydia's side or are we going to be on Mr. Mornington's side? Because that's kind of how the book pans out. And this is a difficult moment for poor Lydia. It says, Lydia gave one of her expressive glances that told of despair at Louisa, but mechanically walked up to the side of her mother with a deep blush, as if to find some shelter from the intrusion of the unlucky lover. And I should say that here, that lover, this is the old use of lover. This is somebody who loves. That's what a lover is. This has nothing to do with sex. Maybe I should have said that right at the start. I forget that usage has changed and I'm kind of very familiar with this Victorian usages. He is a lover because he loves. That's all. And here is our introduction to Mr. Mornington. Mr. Mornington's bow on entering the drawing room was not in that elegant style that might for the moment have propitiated his admired, refined and perhaps over-refined Lydia. It was the bow of a man who had been perfectly taught that mode of salutation by his quondam dancing master. He bent the whole upper part of his Herculean form, and he made a strange and very unnecessary movement with one leg, which she declared always made her fancy she saw a bear learning to dance on a hot floor. So he's not making a good impression. He's awkward and he's a little clumsy and his movements don't come naturally to him. The problems go on. Both hands were encased in a pair of bright yellow shining gloves, which were evidently so tightly strained that they looked as if the next moment must behold them bursting. The cane which one of those huge hands grasped was a bad attempt at elegance. His very marked plaid waistcoat was anything but well chosen, and only seemed to add to the vast breadth of his chest and shoulders. And there was an exuberance of chains and pins and studs about his upper man which offended Lydia's eye to the greatest degree, and brought to her recollection some of the men she had seen serving in the great London shops the few times in her young life that she had had the opportunity of beholding that race of beings. She doesn't like his face either. The features were not actually bad, but they were large and blunt, and there was a floridness about his unluckily too fair complexion, and a roundness and pale blueness in his eyes, as well as a sandiness about the thick stubble-like hair, which, when it came to whiskers, bordered on the red. Yet, as Sir William had said, there were those who might have declared him to be a fine-looking man. Among farmers, probably, he might have ranked as a modern Antinous. And that's a pretty huge insult. If he was a farmer, you'd say he looked good. He was an only child, and his parents thought he was the most handsome, amazing, admirable creature in the world. And he's sort of grown up just believing that. He's not in an arrogant way, just with a confidence in himself because of that, which is fantastic. It's what you want to do for your children. But Consequently, he's a little blind to his faults. Mornington, naturally enough, in consequence of such parental adoration, had all his life been tolerably well satisfied with what he considered his many recommendations, until he became acquainted with his admired and elegant Lydia. But there was an air of high breeding about that young lady, accompanied at times by a quiet, penetrating glance of the eye, and an occasional half good-humoured, half satirical smile, that had given him a novel and unpleasant feeling of doubt as to whether he really possessed the attractive qualifications which hitherto he had felt pretty secure had fallen to his lot. Yes, I know, it's a wordy way of saying she has a way of looking at him that makes him doubt himself. Yet she fascinated him all the while. And so the next few pages are all about that, about how he is pretty much besotted with her, and he loves her elegance and her refinement that is just so natural she's not even really aware of it. And I think this is all just so that the reader sees just how difficult this is going to be. They're very different people, and they've got very different backgrounds. And things could be awkward, except little Fanny is there, and Fanny is a happy, chatty person who breaks the ice everywhere she goes. So it's all simple while she's there. There are a few funny bits in this. There's this scene, once Fanny goes to bed, they have a cup of tea, and it says that Mornington couldn't manage to sit near Lydia, which is what he really wanted. He was forced to content himself with as many looks as so recent an acknowledgement of his devoted admiration would allow of, and also with praising the tea she made, which wasn't really making, by the way. This is making in 1850s aristocracy. She poured the tea and put milk and sugar in it. That's making the tea that the servants have brought in on a tray. Praising the tea she made, which he pronounced to be the very best it had ever been his good fortune to taste. But unfortunately, perhaps to lengthen out his enjoyment, he slowly drank up his whole cupful with his teaspoon, sip after sip, in so sadly audible a manner that the annoyed Lydia contracted her brow and gave sundry glances from under her eyelids at Louisa, the meaning of which the latter perfectly comprehended. And I'm with her there. I mean, that's gross. So Sir William is keeping the conversation going. They're talking of crops, the neighbourhood. They're talking of the fine timber on Mr. Mornington's estate and its increasing value. But Lydia finds the whole thing boring. She doesn't think he's saying anything she wants to hear. And it says, she was not at all sorry when the first trial evening was ended, and readily gave him a farewell shake of the hand at his departure, although she had withheld the one of welcome upon his arrival. But she was so pleased to think he was going that she felt quite in good humour with the poor man. And finally, it's only the family, and Lydia can tell Louisa everything that's happened and what she thinks of it. But it says here she didn't find any way of talking to her mother, who is someone else she would have liked to talk to. And that seems really unfair, that they're in the same house all day. She's had an offer of marriage. You'd think her mother would want to talk to her. You'd think that would be such a priority that they could slip away from the guests or whatever. They could find a way to have a word in private. But they haven't, because the social needs, and because Sir William insists on that. It's getting late, but I'm so close to the end here. Some of the reason that Lady Middlemore can't talk to Lydia is because of Sir William and his household rules. And there's one in particular. It says, Lydia could not find an opportunity that night of saying a word to her mother respecting Mr. Mornington's proposal, as Lady Middlemore never could find any spare time to dawdle agreeably with her daughters. in their apartments or her own, as one of Sir William's fancies was that Lady Middlemore should never be out of bed more than 5 minutes after himself, as he had long taken it into his head that, gentle as she was, she disturbed him if she delayed longer. Which means that if Sir William went to bed, Lady Middlemore had to go to bed too. And you can see if that's how she was living, that she would try to find ways of controlling the household. But at this point, it still seems to me like Sir William is firmly in control, and any control that she thinks she has is kind of just for her own consolation. I mean, she had no choice. She got married. Marriage was permanent. So she had to make the best of it. And Sir William isn't too bad. He just has set ways. He's not violent or critical. In fact, he seems to think quite highly of her opinion. So in many ways, in real ways, she's doing all right in this marriage. It's just these little things where she has to do as she's told, kind of, which is extra hard to see from the modern day looking at it. So this is the last section in this chapter. Lydia and Louisa have retired to their bedroom so that they can finally have their talk. And the chapter ends with Lady Middlemore going into her bedroom. She's very tired and she's hoping to find her husband asleep and that she can just go to sleep. But he's awake and waiting for her because he wants to talk over this marriage. And he says, "My dear, I wish to talk to you a little, if you please." "Certainly," replied the complacent wife, knowing beforehand everything he was about to utter. And I think this might come back a bit to Lydia's statement that she wants to marry somebody of equal intellect to herself. When she said that in the library, Lady Middlemore looked up from her knitting just very briefly. And Lydia noticed that and thought that that was a sign of approval. I think it was sort of pointing out that Lady Middlemore might be lacking that in her own marriage. So William is a good man and very respectable, but he certainly doesn't seem very intellectual. And if she is, then we don't know her well enough yet to know. But it is saying here that she knows everything he's going to say. She does know him quite well. But she's very tired, and what he wants to know is, what does she think of Mr. Mornington's proposal? And then he goes on to say that he thinks it's a great match, and she says, pretty much as Lydia did earlier, "How can you tell that Mr. Mornington is all that you think?" And Sir William still can't answer that. And then he says, and he's probably quite right here, she's so unlikely to meet somebody who is really superior. So they have a bit of talk about that, about even if the man that she describes is out there, he's unlikely to want her because she's actually poor and doesn't have rank. Which is an interesting thing because he's a baronet and his wife is Lady Middlemore, so they do have rank. But in the hierarchy of titles, as it were, you go, Duke down to Earl, and Baronet is kind of the bottom one. The only one below that gives you a title is a knight, and a knight is conferred on you. And there are hereditary knighthoods, but generally speaking, the knighthood stays with the one person, which is how it was with Sir William Lucas in Pride and Prejudice. He thinks that Mornington is a good match. Here we have Lady Middlemore's name. Her name is Catherine. And he says, "I do hope, therefore, my dear Catherine, that you will combat the inclination I plainly see she has to dismiss Mornington altogether, and let him have at least a fair trial. And I depend upon you not to say anything about him that may confirm her present dislike." So, basically, he's telling Catherine, make sure that Lydia really does give him a fair trial. And that's where the chapter ends. So my final thoughts on that, I feel like I haven't made a very good job of explaining the chapter. That's in many ways because it's very bitty and absolutely full of double negatives and convoluted sentences and digressions within digressions. There is one sentence in there that is nearly half a page long. And the bits that I read out, I skipped bits in the middle of most of those. They were not It's all over the place. I think Augusta Lyons probably would have done better to stick with one character, although I do see what she's doing. She's introducing us to the family, to all the individual members and how they're feeling about this circumstance. So that as we go on, we don't need to keep revisiting that. We know it already. We can just get on with the story from this point on. I don't actually think we do. I think the next chapter is kind of similar in that we move out into the grounds and we see Mr. Mornington's house, and there's going to be a bit of discussion about his house as well as the Grange. His house, I think, was called Highlands, so we've got Highlands and we've got the Grange. But by the third chapter, we're through it all. So we've just got to get through this beginning bit. It was a difficult chapter, and not a great deal happened other than setting up the scenario. Mr. Mornington made his proposal. Lydia said no, and now she's going to do her best to be charitable, which is something that she wanted in a husband that she doesn't seem to realise she might be lacking in herself. And that's really all I need to say about that one. The next video will be nowhere near as long. The first one is long because of all the explanation. And so for now, thank you for watching.